There's a specific kind of man who becomes almost impossible to read once you meet him, not because he's cold, not because he's hiding something, but because he simply stopped needing anything from you to feel like himself. No performance, no proving, no chasing your approval with his eyes the second he says something vulnerable. And most people who encounter a man like this make the exact same mistake. They assume he doesn't feel much. They couldn't be more wrong. Psychology has a name for the process that gets a man to this place, and once you understand the mechanics behind it, you'll never mistake this kind of calm for indifference again. Some people call this the Sophia Stage, borrowing the name from the ancient Gnostic concept of divine wisdom, Sophia, the kind of knowing that comes only after descending into darkness and returning changed. But strip away the mythology, and what's actually happening here is something psychology has studied for decades, under names like individuation, shadow integration, and self-differentiation. Today, I want to walk you through exactly how a man gets here, what changes inside him once he arrives, and why this stage is, without question, one of the most misunderstood forms of psychological maturity a person can reach. To understand how a man enters this stage, you first have to understand what usually breaks before it happens. Almost nobody arrives here through a gentle, gradual process of self-improvement. Most men get here because something collapsed. It could be the end of a relationship he was using, without realizing it, as the entire foundation of his identity. It could be a loss that stripped away a persona he'd spent years building. It could simply be a level of internal exhaustion so total that he could no longer keep performing wellness he didn't actually feel. Carl Jung described the ego as something that functions, when intact, almost like a fortress, keeping out whatever is too painful to face and keeping in whatever the person doesn't yet have language for. When that fortress cracks, what's left isn't a broken man. What's left is an exposed one. And what he does with that exposure determines everything that follows. Here's the part almost nobody talks about honestly. Most men, when the fortress falls, immediately build a new one, a faster one, a more sophisticated one, sometimes even a more spiritual one, dressed up in the right vocabulary, borrowed from a few self-help books or a therapy session or two, but structurally identical to the ego defense that just collapsed, only repackaged to look more evolved. A man entering the Sophia stage doesn't do this. He stays in the open field. He lets the pain move through him without numbing it. In Jungian terms, he descends into the shadow, that unconscious territory where the parts of himself he spent a lifetime rejecting have been quietly living the entire time, and he looks directly at them without flinching away. And what he finds down there is rarely flattering. He finds fear, the fear of not being enough, of needing someone, of failing publicly, of feeling too much in front of people who might use it against him. He finds shame for moments of weakness, for having hurt people he loved, for not fully knowing who he is when nobody's watching to perform for. He finds anger, old and pressurized, the kind he learned years ago to relabel as coolness, independence, detachment. And instead of resolving this material, erasing it, or transcending it in some tidy self-help sense, he integrates it, which in psychological terms means something very specific. He carries it forward consciously, as part of who he is, rather than splitting it off and pretending it isn't there. And once that integration starts happening, something shifts in how he relates to other people. He stops running from himself. And once a man stops running from himself, he also stops running from the people close to him out of cowardice. If he creates distance now, it's a choice, made from clarity, not an escape, made from fear. That distinction sounds subtle when you say it out loud. In practice, it changes everything. So how do you actually recognize a man who's reached this stage? The first sign is that he stops fighting to win the narrative. An immature ego in conflict needs to be understood, needs the other person to validate his version of events, needs to walk away from an argument having proven his point. When that doesn't happen, he escalates, repeats himself, goes quiet as punishment, or comes back later trying to relitigate the whole thing. A man in the Sophia stage doesn't operate this way. When conflict shows up, he actually listens, not waiting for his turn to respond, but genuinely trying to understand. And when he speaks, he says it once, clearly, without needing agreement to feel okay about what he said. Then he lets the disagreement exist without needing to resolve it into a win. People who learn to measure love by the intensity of an argument often misread this as not caring. He cares plenty. He just stopped needing to be right in order to feel secure. The second sign shows up in something harder to describe than words, closer to a quality of presence you feel before you've consciously processed it. A man in this stage doesn't occupy a room the way someone still auditioning for approval does. There's no urgency behind his eyes, no subtle bid for admiration hidden inside his tone, no grip in how he holds a conversation. He simply arrives, whole, quiet, and settled inside himself. For a nervous system trained to associate love with intensity and unpredictability, this steadiness can actually feel disorienting at first because his presence doesn't shout for attention. It just exists. And presence that comes from somewhere real tends to carry more weight than any performance ever could. The third sign is that he stops using self-awareness as an excuse. This is one of the most important distinctions because there's a version of emotional intelligence that gets used as a shield instead of a tool. Phrases like, "I'm working on myself," or "I just need time," deployed specifically to avoid taking responsibility. A man in the Sophia Stage uses that same language completely differently, to actually own what happened, not to dodge it. If he made a mistake, he names it directly, without needing someone else to point it out first. If he can't be present right now, he says so honestly, instead of leaving someone waiting indefinitely for an explanation that never comes. The fourth sign is that he no longer needs your admiration to feel real. This one tends to be the most disruptive of all because needing someone's admiration is one of the most common invisible currencies in relationships. When a person needs to be admired, the other party holds real power over them, simply through how they choose to look at him. A man who's done this internal work sees himself clearly enough that he doesn't need to borrow that reflection from anyone else. Someone can withdraw admiration to test him, and he won't waver. Someone can offer it freely, and he'll receive it with gratitude, not hunger. And for a person used to using attention as leverage, this can feel deeply unsettling because that particular lever simply stops working. There's something important to say here, and it's not comfortable. A man at this stage tends to expose things without ever intending to. Not on purpose and not maliciously, but the quality of his presence functions almost like a light landing on whatever's been sitting in someone else's blind spots. When a person isn't testing you, isn't performing, isn't playing games, whatever drama shows up in the interaction is the part you brought into the room. And being seen that clearly, with nowhere left to hide behind strategy, can feel genuinely unnerving to anyone who learned to navigate relationships through tactics rather than honesty. It's worth being honest about something else, too. Reaching this stage comes with a real cost. A man here loses the comfort of certain excuses, the identity of someone perpetually waiting for the right timing, the permission to put his actual life on hold while he waits for clarity that was never going to arrive on its own. Sovereignty, in the psychological sense, demands full responsibility for your own choices, and that responsibility is genuinely frightening for a lot of people, because it's far easier to stay the passive character in an intense story than to become the author of an ordinary, deliberate life. There's also a relational cost. Some connections simply don't survive contact with this level of clarity, not because love disappeared, but because the standard for honesty just got too high for a dynamic that used to run on half-truths and unspoken tension. If you recognize this pattern in someone in your life, or if you're somewhere in the middle of this collapse and rebuild process yourself, here's the piece that actually matters. This stage isn't the finish line. It's the beginning of the part that asks the most of you. A man who's done this work no longer has the excuse of unconsciousness, and once he doesn't, the people around him tend to lose that excuse too. That's uncomfortable. It's also, according to nearly everyone who's actually walked through it, the only version of stability that ever turns out to be real. If this gave you language for something you've been sensing but couldn't quite name, drop the words "I choose clarity" in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring how the mind actually works through pain and change, consider subscribing to the channel, because we're going to keep having this conversation right here. Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next video.